first off, so people who don't know about the Peloponnesian War, can you give us a brief background about the war, the people with who the war was with, the key players, and just a quick overview of the war for us, please?
Definitely. So like the Peloponnesian War, just to kind of to introduce it to anyone who's never heard about it, it was a war in ancient Greece between Sparta and Athens, who were at the time like the two biggest powers in all of Greece. So Athens at the time, this is by the way the 5th century BC, so it's 431 BC where the war kicks off. And before that, during like the 440s, the 450s, all the way up to 490 and 500, Athens has been accumulating power, right? This is after the Persian Wars, which were in the very late 500s, the early 400s. The Persian Wars, essentially, Persia invaded all of Greece. King Xerxes, I don't know if you guys ever watched like 300, you'll know it from there, where essentially all of Greece banded together. The Spartans on the forefront, but also the Athenians with the Spartans. They were fighting the Persians, and they were fighting off this invasion. And it was like this huge existential threat towards all of Greece. Every Greek knew that if they were conquered by Persians, they would be made slaves. Their culture, their way of life would essentially cease to exist. So they all banded together, and they all thought, okay, you know what? Let's form a huge alliance, and let's be like a united Greece, kind of, a united front against Persia. And they won, which was fantastic, and everybody was so proud of themselves. But here's the funny part. Like, once the war stopped, the alliances, they were still there. And like the big players, they were still there. So Sparta, at the top of everything, they kind of withdrew. They went back to their home and they were like, you know what, we don't want any more war. We just want to kind of be safe at home. This has also something to do with like how their state is structured. I'm going to get into this probably a little later. But like Sparta is very hesitant to ever go like outside on war because they don't want to leave their home for too long. Then you have Athens. And like Athens, they're not, like during the Persian Wars, they're a big state, they're a powerful state, but they're not like the biggest and they're not the most powerful. It's not like the most impressive state you've ever seen. However, after the Persian Wars, they start to rebuild and they start to kind of like build up a new city wall, which was a big deal during the war because like no Greek state ever had like a wall like this. Back then they also didn't have any like siege engines or like catapults or whatever, so they couldn't penetrate a wall. It's like building up a wall was kind of like people were taking them more seriously. And also during like some kind of revenge campaigns, which the Greeks did after the Persian War. So they went out and fought against Persia on Persian soil. During that, the Athenians took a much more central role. So the Spartans, they didn't want to come, they didn't want to go out that far. They had some scandals as well. So they didn't want to get involved, but the Athenians, they took leadership. And the Athenians formed a new alliance around them. An alliance of all the states that aren't part of like the southern part of Greece, the Peloponnese, where the Spartans are, but like all the northernmost parts and, all the western parts of Greece. They essentially all joined in with Athens, and Athens was kind of like, growing bigger, building up their navy. They were always a seafaring state, so they were like massively involved with like shipfaring and naval warfare, etc., etc. And that's how Athens became so big, right? And then essentially during the 450s and 440s, Athens was a power that rivaled Sparta. It was, a massive empire. We'll get into this as well, how this was structured, because it was actually super interesting. But yeah, just to kind of like round it off this answer, this is how they kind of came to be in conflict.
Exactly, and so this is why those two powers had enough influence to cause something like this to kind of escalate.
Exactly.
Okay, now I want to get into the actual causes of the war. So this is like the beginning. So you mentioned obviously Athens growing power and Spartans kind of like kind of exclusive, kind of stayed in themselves. There are some skirmishes that happen around obviously the Greeks, and then this leads to them going to Athens and going to Sparta to ask for help. And talk to me about that. Talk to me about some of the things that, some of the kind of conversations or some of the actions that led to the war starting in the first place.
So essentially what happened was, you have these two big alliances around Sparta and Athens, and all the Greek states, they know about this obviously. They know that Athens is a big dog in in like their area. Sparta is the big dog in their area. So they all kind of start aligning with each other. They all kind of start aligning with either one of the great powers. And Sparta and Athens already come to blows, I think in the 440s, about like a state that, two states were making war against each other. I believe Corinth was involved. Sorry, my knowledge isn't super up to date on that part of the history, but they already come to blows. They're already kind of like in a conflict with each other, and they start to realize, okay, a war between us looks very disastrous. We have the potential to wipe each other out. We have the potential to have all the states in Greece essentially fight each other because they're all allied with either you or me. So that's in the 440s, how they kind of see, okay, this is gonna be, if this is gonna escalate, this is gonna be a big war. So they make peace, and they try their best for like the next 10 years or so to like maintain peace. And there's some really interesting stuff that actually happens in that time. Some interesting like foreign policy stuff, which is a first in the world. Like in recorded history, this is kind of like the first time where we have like complex international relations, complex alliances, complex state relations. And to kind of like go really answer your question, go into like how it actually started. So we have this little city-state called Epidamnus. And Epidamnus is like a colony, I believe, of, don't let me get this wrong, it's a colony of Corinth, I'm pretty sure. And Corinth was essentially not a very good mother city to Epidamnus. They always had kind of like some arguments ongoing. And in the end, Epidamnus, they asked Corinth for help. I believe they had some issues with like some other tribes in the area who were making them trouble or whatever. And they asked Corinth for help, and Corinth is like, no, you're on your own, we don't like you. And Epidamnus is just like, okay, fine. I'm going to go ask somewhere else. So they asked Corcyra. And Corcyra is like, hell yes, this is a great opportunity to kind of like expand our influence. They help Epidamnus. And Epidamnus says, okay, we like disown Corinth. We're going to stop calling them our founding colony. We're instead going to like swear allegiance, or like at least give credit to Corcyra as like the big savior of our city-state. They like erect a statue or something. And Corinth does not like this at all. Despite the fact that they didn't want to help, they were like, this is like, you can't just disown us, you can't just cut us out of the picture. This is kind of like an attack on our power as a city-state. So this is how it kind of like escalates between Corcyra and Corinth, where they kind of like start squabbling over this little territory, Epidamnus. And the interesting part is Corinth is the biggest ally of Sparta. And that's how Sparta gets initially involved, because like Corinth is very aggressive about it. Corinth wants to go to war with Corcyra. And Corcyra gets worried because Corcyra doesn't yet have any big allies. Corcyra is pretty independent. They have a big navy, but they might not be able to resist a Spartan force coming against them. So Corcyra becomes, increasingly more worried, and they say, okay, we'll go to Athens. We'll go to Athens. We tell them, look, we're at war with Corinth, and we need your help. And we're worried that Sparta's going to come and wipe us out. And like Athens is hesitant because they know that Corcyra's at war with Corinth. If they ally themselves with Corcyra, this might lead to a major war against Sparta, because then those two alliances, they're going to clash. And it's a huge deal. Everyone is kind of like, everyone is looking at them and it's kind of like, dude, do you really want to do this? Do you really want to go in there? And this is where it gets interesting, because this is where the Corcyrans make their most important argument. An argument that you'll see over and over again in this historical text. And also an argument that I would argue is pretty much reflective of any political security situation. So Corcyra goes to Athens and says, okay, imagine this. Imagine Corinth comes up with Sparta, they defeat us. What then? Because when we're a defeated state, they're going to take our people's slaves, and they're also going to take all our resources. And our resources include our navy. So like Corcyra has like 100 or 120 ships or so. And it's like essentially the second biggest navy in all of Greece, the biggest navy being Athenian navy. And this is where Athens perks up, because they're like, our only advantage is that we have the biggest navy in Greece. If Sparta and Corinth get this navy, we will be under threat. So essentially this consideration that was initially about like keeping peace, and initially about like, okay, do we want to get involved in a conflict that isn't ours, and should we like start this war? Now it becomes a question of self-interest. Now it becomes like, okay, what if they threaten us? What if they become as powerful as we are, and essentially dethrone us or destroy us? And this is why Athens decides, okay, we're going to ally ourselves with Corcyra. We're going to ally ourselves with them and take their ships into our navy so that Sparta will not get them if they ever win. And this is how the war breaks out. This is how it essentially, like, it's so funny to me because like in a bid to avoid a potential war against Sparta, where Sparta might have a bigger navy, they start an actual war against Sparta, which leads ultimately to the destruction of Athens.
We'll get into that. We'll get into how these actions actually lead to the destruction of Athens. But two of the big players you mentioned is Sparta and Athens. So let's first take them aside and let's look at them each individually. So first of all, Athens. You mentioned they've got a big navy, right? Yeah. Speak more about that. Speak more about when they were coming into this. Obviously, they're now bringing in this nation who was has the second biggest navy into them. So now they're strong and they're looking like, actually, if we go into this war, we're in a good position. Speak more about what they were thinking, how they were positioned even from not being their player to now thinking they actually have a chance against Sparta. Yeah. What was the thinking like in Athens around this time?
So that's a very